July 9th, 1944, Western Kansas. The morning sun had only just cleared the horizon when the truck rolled to a halt on the edge of a vast wheat field. Golden stalks stretched so far that the German prisoners thought they were staring at an ocean made of grain. Dust settled slowly around the tires. No guards barked orders, no rifles were raised. The silence itself felt like a trap. Otto Weber, 23, a former mechanic from Hamburg, stepped down from the truck last. He still carried the same hollow-eyed look he'd worn since Tunisia, since captivity, since propaganda had warned him that America was a land of brutality and revenge. Yet what he saw that morning did not match the warnings at all. An American farmer, tall, sunburned, wearing denim overalls and a sweat-stained hat, walked straight toward the group of 30 German POWs. No escorts, no soldiers at his side, just a man with calloused hands and a slow, steady stride. He looked them over as if they were simply hired workers who had arrived late. Then came the shock. He pulled a ring of metal from his pocket and tossed it toward Otto. The German caught it reflexively. It was a set of keys. Barn keys. The farmer wiped his brow with a red bandana and said in plain, casual English, "I'm driving into town for a meeting. Y'all fix the north barn while I'm gone." There was no threat in his voice, no suspicion, not even hesitation. He simply turned, climbed into his truck, and drove away, leaving 30 enemy soldiers standing alone on his land holding his keys. For several seconds, nobody breathed. It felt like the entire prairie stopped moving. This was not what German soldiers had been told, not what they had prepared for, not what they understood about America. In Germany, the idea of trusting an enemy, especially without guards, fences, or weapons, bordered on madness. Back home, suspicion was a way of life. The Reich demanded obedience, surveillance, and control. Even their own officers assumed betrayal at every turn. Yet here, in the middle of Kansas, a simple American farmer had just entrusted his entire property to the enemy with the same ease he might show a neighbor's teenage sons. The Germans exchanged looks of disbelief. "He left," muttered one. "Completely left. No guards. Nothing. Is this a trick?" But no one answered, because nothing about this place, this land of endless crops, this sky too big to comprehend, these Americans who behaved without fear, made any sense. What Otto didn't know was that Kansas in 1944 was a place transformed by war. Over 12 million American men were serving overseas, leaving farms across the Midwest dangerously short-handed. The wheat had to be harvested. The barns had to be repaired. Cattle had to be fed. And with sons fighting in Europe and the Pacific, the farmers who remained had no choice but to rely on help from the very men their children were fighting. That summer, German POWs became essential labor, not prisoners behind barbed wire, but workers in the fields of America's agricultural heartland. Texas, Kansas, Nebraska. These were the states that fed a nation at war, delivering grain, beef, and dairy at a scale unmatched in human history. And because the United States adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention, far more than any Axis power, these prisoners were not starved or abused. They were fed American rations, paid small wages, given medical care, and assigned honest work. By 1944, America held over 425,000 German POWs in more than 700 camps across 46 states. It was the largest such system ever built on U.S. soil. But what shocked the prisoners most was not the number of camps or the size of the country. It was the culture of trust woven into the fabric of American daily life. A trust that seemed impossible to men raised under dictatorship. Otto stared at the keys in his hand, his fingers unconsciously tightening around the cold metal. He felt something unfamiliar. Confusion, wrapped in fear. This wasn't cruelty. It wasn't interrogation. It wasn't punishment. But that only made it more unsettling. He turned to the others. "What do we do?" he whispered. "Work," someone else said with a shrug. That is what he said. But even that sounded absurd. How could enemies simply work unsupervised on an American farm? Why would a nation winning the largest war in human history waste trust on men who had tried to kill them? Otto looked again at the horizon, a line so straight it could have been drawn with a ruler. Wheat bowed in the wind like a sea of gold. It was a world untouched by the ration lines, rubble, starvation, and fear consuming Europe. A world where abundance felt endless. A world so confident in its strength that it could afford to be kind. For the Americans, sending POWs to work in the fields was practical. For the prisoners, it was unthinkable. Trust was the one thing they never expected to receive. Otto closed his hand around the keys, and in that moment something inside him shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a stone beginning to crack. It was not understanding. Not yet. But it was the first hint that the world was larger than the Reich had allowed him to believe. Behind him, the German prisoners slowly began to move toward the barn, still glancing over their shoulders for guards who never came. The wind carried the smell of warm wheat and freshly cut hay. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor engine thumped steadily, a heartbeat of the land. Nothing about this morning should have been possible. Enemy soldiers expected chains. America gave them keys. And Otto Weber, gripping those keys tightly, realized he had entered a country that obeyed a different logic. A place where the strength to fight a world war coexisted with a generosity so overwhelming it felt like a challenge to everything he thought he knew. The day had only begun. But the fracture in his belief had already formed. Otto Weber stood in the doorway of the Kansas barn, the keys still warm in his palm, his stomach twisting in a knot that felt sharper with every passing minute. Behind him, the other German prisoners moved cautiously through the dust-filled air, each step hesitant, each gesture small and deliberate, as though even breathing too loudly might trigger some hidden trap. They had been ordered to repair the storm-damaged north wall of the barn, replace broken planks, tighten the beams, clear out the debris. On paper, it was simple farm labor, but in their minds, shaped by years of warnings and whispered threats from Nazi officers, nothing about this place could be simple. "Be careful," murmured Franz, a former artillery corporal. "This is how they test prisoners. They leave you alone. Wait to see if someone tries to escape. Then they shoot the whole group." Another man, Dieter, shook his head but didn't argue. Instead, he peered nervously across the fields, scanning for hidden patrols, half expecting American soldiers to burst from behind the wheat with rifles drawn. His voice trembled despite the heat. "If we take one wrong step, if we cross some invisible line, that's when they'll strike." Otto didn't respond. He wanted to say the Americans didn't seem like the type to stage elaborate traps, but the words stuck in his throat. The truth was, he didn't know what to believe. The last 3 years of war had conditioned him to flinch at kindness. On the Eastern Front, kindness got you killed. In North Africa, mercy was a luxury neither side could afford. And in Germany, every scrap of propaganda had drilled the same lesson into him. Americans torture prisoners. Surrender is worse than death. He remembered the training films, grotesque caricatures of American soldiers dragging Germans behind jeeps, beating them, starving them. Officers repeated the warnings before every deployment. Capture means humiliation. They will treat you like animals. Fight to the last bullet. His mother, too, had whispered it during their last goodbye. Don't let them take you, Otto. Americans are not like us. But here he was, standing in the doorway of an American barn, holding American keys, ordered to do American work, without a single gun pointed at his back. That contradiction was more frightening than a rifle. Fear of cruelty was familiar. Fear of kindness was something else entirely. Inside the barn, the men worked slowly, each movement stiff with tension. No one spoke unless necessary. They lifted broken planks, hammered nails, cleared the old straw. But their eyes were always drifting, toward the empty dirt road, toward the distant horizon, toward the farmhouse where the farmer had driven away. "Why no guards?" Franz muttered for the 10th time. "Why give us tools?" another asked. "Hammers, saws, even a ladder? These could be weapons." "Maybe that's the point," Dieter whispered. "If we run, they will claim we armed ourselves." The paranoia wasn't irrational, not after what they had lived through. Otto thought back to his first days after capture, when American medics had treated his dehydration. He had refused water at first, convinced it was poisoned. It took 3 attempts before he dared swallow it. Even then, he waited for the pain that never came. Then, during processing, he had seen something else that still troubled him. A Red Cross official inspecting the camp conditions, taking notes, asking questions, demanding better blankets for the prisoners, arguing with an American officer about rations. In the Reich, such a thing was unimaginable. Nobody inspected the camps, nobody advocated for the enemy. But here, in America, the rules were different. Under the Geneva Convention, German POWs were entitled to 204,000 calories a day, access to medical care, male privileges, libraries, classes, and even sports fields. Across the country, camps had baseball diamonds, orchestras, newspaper clubs. Some had churches built entirely by prisoners. Others offered English classes taught by local volunteers. This, too, inspired fear, a quiet, creeping fear that shook them more deeply than any threat of violence. "What if this is all temporary?" Dieter whispered once. "What if they treat us well just to soften us?" And then, "They won't," Otto said, but the confidence in his voice sounded hollow, because he still couldn't believe it fully. The distance between what he'd been taught and what he was living felt like standing between 2 different worlds, and neither felt entirely real. In the barn's shadows, the men worked, their minds drifting back to the darkness they had left behind. Otto remembered the retreat through Tunisia, the nights without food, the days without water, the way German officers threatened to shoot anyone who spoke of surrender. He remembered seeing comrades executed by their own men for stepping out of formation. He remembered the fear that had ruled every moment of his life. Now, that fear hovered over them like a ghost, whispering that kindness concealed danger, that trust was a weapon, that Americans could not be as honest as they appeared. At midday, heat pooled inside the barn, thick and heavy. Sweat ran down their backs, soaked their collars. The Germans stepped outside to cool off, still keeping close to one another, instinctively forming the tight formation of soldiers who expected ambush at any moment. The road remained empty. The sky remained enormous. The only sound was wind brushing through wheat. "It doesn't make sense," Franz said quietly. "Why would a country strong enough to win this war risk letting prisoners work freely?" Otto looked out at the fields, the endless, unbroken fields, and felt a strange ache in his chest. This land was too big to control through fear. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe America didn't need to rule through terror because it didn't need to be afraid. But that idea felt dangerous, because if it was true, then everything the Reich had taught them was a lie. Behind them, the barn creaked softly in the heat. The men returned to their work, but now their movements were even slower, burdened by a fear that wasn't physical. A fear of unraveling, of losing the mental armor they had worn for years. Otto knelt to pick up a fallen beam. His hands trembled slightly. Not from exhaustion, not from hunger, from the terrifying possibility that the Americans were exactly what they seemed. Honest, confident, unfazed by the presence of the enemy, strong enough to trust. He didn't know which was more frightening, the brutality he had been taught to expect, or the kindness he was beginning to see. One thing was certain: the fear had not diminished. It had simply changed shape. And Otto Weber, standing beneath the vast Kansas sky, felt that shift like the first crack in a wall he had spent his whole life building. By late afternoon, the heat began to soften, and a thin line of cloud drifted over the Kansas sky. Otto and the other German prisoners had worked in tense silence for hours, all of them waiting for the farmer's return, waiting for the trap to spring. Every sound, a creaking board, the distant rumble of a grain truck, even the rustling of wheat, made them stiffen. But when the crunch of tires finally came from the dirt road, it wasn't followed by shouting or gunfire. The farmer's truck rolled to a gentle stop beside the barn. The door slammed shut, but not with force. He hopped down, dusting off his hat, and walked toward them with the relaxed stride of a man returning home after a long day. "Well," he said, surveying the barn wall with a slow nod, "looks like you boys got it standing again." There was no sarcasm, no suspicion, just a simple, honest compliment, and somehow that alone felt disorienting. The farmer opened the truck bed and pulled out a wooden crate. Inside were apples, bright red, polished by sunlight, the kind Otto hadn't seen since before the war. The farmer set the crate on the ground and gestured. "Go on now," he said. "Help yourselves." No one moved. Some of the men looked at each other as if expecting a hidden signal. Otto's throat tightened. The farmer hesitated for only a heartbeat, then reached in, grabbed an apple, and took a large bite. Juice dripped from the corner of his mouth. He chewed deliberately. "See?" he said. "Ain't poison." That broke the spell. Slowly, cautiously, the German stepped forward. Franz reached for an apple first, as if expecting it to vanish before he could take it. Dieter held his like it was a precious relic. Otto turned his over in his hand, feeling its weight, its coolness, the firmness of the skin beneath his thumb. He lifted it to his nose. The smell was crisp, sweet, impossibly familiar. Back home, apples had become rare long before he left for Tunisia. Rations had shrunk year after year. His mother used to cut a single apple into thin slices so it could be shared among 3 children. But here, in America, the fruit was abundant. Overflowing from crates, hanging heavy on trees along the road, even left in baskets at store entrances just to be generous. Industrial abundance wasn't an idea to the Americans. It was simply their daily life. The men bit into their apples, and for the first time since capture, the barn was filled with sound that wasn't fear. Soft, almost embarrassed murmurs of satisfaction. The farmer wasn't finished. He reached into the crate again and lifted out 2 glass bottles of milk, chilled enough to gather condensation in the heat. "I figured you'd be thirsty," he said. "Got more in town. I'll bring some next time." His voice carried the gentle practicality of the Bible Belt, the quiet belief that kindness was a duty, not an exception. a faith that hospitality wasn't something reserved for friends, but for anyone who crossed your land. "If a man works," he added casually, "he deserves a meal." The words hit Otto harder than the apple's sweetness. He had grown up hearing something very different. A man deserved only what the state allowed. Here, morality came not from ideology, but from everyday decency. The kindness continued in small, surprising waves. A few days later, after another long day of repairing fence posts, the farmer returned not alone, but with his wife. She stepped out of the truck holding a basket covered with a blue-checked cloth. When she lifted the fabric, the aroma hit them instantly. Cinnamon, butter, and warm fruit. Apple pie, not rations, not bread. "Pie." She spoke softly, her Kansas accent light and warm. "Thought you boys might like something sweet after all that work." The prisoners froze again. Kindness, they were learning, could be just as frightening as any weapon, but infinitely harder to defend against. Otto watched as the woman cut generous slices, handing them out without hesitation. When she reached him, she smiled, the kind of smile that made him feel seen, not as a prisoner, but as a young man far from home. "You remind me of my son," she said, pressing a slice into his hand. "He's about your age, fighting in France." Otto's breath caught. He stared at the pie, then at her face, and felt his chest tighten. The Americans had sons in the war, too. Sons who might be fighting his own brothers. Sons who might never come home. Yet here she was, offering him pie as if sorrow didn't demand cruelty. He whispered, "Danke," the only word he could manage. A week later, a cowboy arrived at the farm to help move cattle from one pasture to another. The POWs kept their distance at first. The cowboy looked like something from an American legend, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat that shaded half his face. His horse snorted, stamping its hooves in the dusty yard. The farmer approached Otto and nodded toward the herd. "Need some extra hands today. You boys can ride?" The Germans blinked. "Ride? Horses?" Franz laughed quietly. "Is he mocking us?" But the cowboy shook his head. He dismounted, walked straight up to Otto, and held out the reins. "She's gentle," he said. "Name's Daisy." He paused. "You ever been on a horse before, son?" "Son." The word felt like a bridge. Otto shook his head, embarrassed. "Nein. No, sir." "Well then," the cowboy said, "reckon today's a good day to learn." Before Otto could protest, the cowboy lifted him lightly by the arm. Not forcefully, but with the easy strength of a man who'd spent his life working outdoors, and helped him into the saddle. The German men watched, stunned, as their comrade adjusted awkwardly, gripping the reins. The cowboy laughed. "Don't look so scared. She won't throw you unless you insult her." Even Otto cracked a smile. By the end of the afternoon, 4 POWs were riding behind the herd, following the cowboy's hand signals through fields that seemed to stretch endlessly. The wind whipped through Otto's hair. For a brief moment, he forgot he was a prisoner. He felt free. But the kindness didn't stop at the farm. Once a month, the POWs were taken back to the main camp for supplies and roll call. One evening, as Otto stood in line outside the mess hall, an elderly American woman in a faded shawl approached the group. She walked slowly, leaning on a cane, her steps careful but determined. The guards stiffened, unsure what she wanted, but she waved them off politely. She approached Otto first. "You look cold," she said simply. Before he could respond, she draped a worn, knitted coat over his shoulders. It smelled faintly of cedar and laundry soap. The sleeves were a little short, but it was warm, warmer than anything he'd worn since leaving Germany. "It belonged to my husband," she whispered. He passed last winter. He'd have wanted someone to use it. Otto tried to hand it back, overwhelmed. I cannot. I am the enemy. She placed a trembling hand on his arm. No, son. You're just somebody's child, far from home. Otto lowered his head, his vision blurred. As weeks passed, kindness became the quiet rhythm of their days. In the camp library, a real library with shelves of English classics and German translations donated by local families, Otto discovered books he never imagined he would see again. American volunteers came once a week to offer English lessons. He learned how to write simple sentences, how to speak clearly, how to say thank you without hesitating. The mess hall served meals that made the men stare in disbelief. Beef stew, thick with meat, white bread still warm from the oven, even coffee on cold mornings. The cooks treated them like workers, not enemies. When one prisoner burned his hand carrying a pot, an American medic bandaged it with care, telling him to rest for a day. Every kindness chipped away at the fear they had carried with them. Every gesture revealed something deeper about the country they were standing in. America wasn't kind because it was weak. America was kind because it was strong enough to be. It had the food. It had the confidence. It had the moral certainty of a nation that didn't fear generosity. The prisoners whispered among themselves at night, "This place, this America, it is not what we were told. Maybe they treat us well because they can. Maybe they want peace after the war. Maybe they see us as future neighbors. Future ambassadors." That was the phrase one camp officer used during a briefing. "Treat them well," he told the guards. "They'll go home one day. And what they tell their families matters." Otto lay awake in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking of his mother, his sister, the neighborhood that might no longer exist. If he ever made it home, what would he say? Would he tell them about the farmer's apples, the cowboy's hand on his shoulder, the old woman's winter coat, the pie that tasted like some lost version of childhood? Would they even believe him? He closed his eyes, holding the coat tighter around his chest. Somewhere far across the ocean, Germany was breaking apart. But here, in the middle of America, something unexpected was beginning to take shape. Something that felt suspiciously like trust. And that, he realized, was the most overwhelming kindness of all. The breakdown did not come in a single moment. It came in waves, quiet, heavy, devastating, each one wearing down the beliefs the prisoners had carried across continents and oceans. For Otto Weber, the collapse began on a day that seemed ordinary, the kind of hot Kansas afternoon that smelled of dust, wheat, and distant rain. It was lunchtime on the farm, and the farmer had driven into town, leaving them a simple instruction. "Go on up to the porch. My wife left something for y'all." The men approached slowly, wary of traps they still couldn't stop imagining. But there were no guards, no fences, no locks. Only a wooden porch shaded by an oak tree, a pitcher of cold water, and a tray of sandwiches covered by a clean cloth. Otto lifted the cloth with trembling fingers. Beef, thick slices, layered generously between soft bread. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single, impossible sight. Back in Germany, beef had disappeared from their diets long before the war turned against them. In the final years, even cities like Hamburg and Munich saw butcher shops empty, ration cards shrinking to nothing, families boiling potatoes until the water turned gray. Soldiers at the front had sometimes gone days without meat. In North Africa, Otto had watched men fight over scraps of tinned rations, their bodies wasting as the desert swallowed German supply lines. But here, in Kansas, a nation that produced half the world's meat, Beef was so abundant that farmers fed it to prisoners like it was nothing. Otto picked up a sandwich. His hands shook uncontrollably. "Eat," Franz said gently. "It's for us." But Otto couldn't lift it to his mouth. His throat tightened. His stomach twisted in a way that wasn't hunger but something far deeper, more painful. "Why?" Otto whispered. "Why would they give this to us?" No one answered. He took a bite. The meat was rich, tender, warm from the sun. He chewed slowly, tasting memories he didn't know he still carried. His mother cooking Sunday roasts, his father carving slices at the table, the sound of rain outside their apartment window in Hamburg. He swallowed, and suddenly the weight of everything he had lost pressed down on him so hard he felt he might collapse. Before he knew he was crying, tears were already falling. Silent at first, then shaking, then uncontrollable. He turned away, wiping his face with the back of his hand, ashamed. Franz stepped beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of quiet solidarity. But Otto wasn't alone. Across the porch, 3 other prisoners had tears in their eyes. One sat on the steps, sandwich forgotten in his lap, sobbing openly. "We don't deserve this," he choked out. "Not after what we did, not after what we believed." Otto couldn't speak. The truth was too heavy to form into words. A few days later, another wave hit, this time in the camp itself. It was shower day. The guards lined up the prisoners outside a long wooden building with steam drifting from the vents. A camp sergeant shouted instructions, but the words barely reached Otto's ears. He stood frozen, his breath shallow. Behind him, Dieter whispered, "This is how they kill us." The thought traveled instantly through the line, infecting the men with the same terror. Showers. Water pipes. Heat. Steam. The images they had been raised on surged forward. Stories of Soviet brutality, rumors of Allied cruelty, the propaganda that never stopped insisting that surrender meant annihilation. Several men stepped back involuntarily. One whispered a prayer, another clenched his fists, preparing for the worst. When the door opened, a wave of warm air washed out. The men flinched. A guard frowned. "What's wrong with y'all? Get in there. Hot water's running." Hot water. The words barely registered. Inside, the showers were simple. Metal pipes, concrete floors, wooden benches. But the moment the prisoners stepped inside, warm water sprayed from above, hitting their bodies with a sensation so foreign, so intimate, that several cried out in shock. Not cold water, not freezing water, not rationed drips. Warm, steady, clean. Otto stood motionless, the water pouring over his face, down his neck, across ribs still sharp from months of malnutrition. The warmth soaked into him like a benediction. He lifted his hands and watched the steam rise from his skin. Soap, real soap, was passed down the line. Franz pressed his forehead against the tile. His shoulders trembled. "Why are they doing this?" he whispered. "For hygiene," a guard said from the doorway. "Ain't complicated." But to the prisoners it was. The last time Otto had felt water like this was before Stalingrad turned into a graveyard of frozen bodies, a city where warmth and cleanliness vanished under ice and hatred. He remembered the marches through Tunisia, the sandstorms cutting into their skin, the thirst that haunted their dreams. He remembered sharing a single canteen with 5 men. He remembered death arriving quietly, as men fell behind in the desert and never returned. Now here he was, standing beneath a cascade of hot water in a country so rich, so abundant, that even its prisoners bathed better than German civilians. A man near the door sank to his knees, sobbing into his hands. Another leaned against the wall and let the tears mingle with the water. Otto closed his eyes, unable to stop his own. This wasn't mercy. This was something more powerful, a kind of everyday generosity that needed no justification. And that realization broke them. The final blow came one evening after work. The farmer invited the prisoners to sit beneath the shade of the oak tree while his wife prepared supper on the porch. The smell drifted out in warm waves. Beef stew rich with vegetables, cornbread studded with kernels of sweet maize, and something else Otto couldn't place at first. Bacon. He froze. Bacon had vanished from German tables by 1942. By 1944, most families saw it once a year, if that. Soldiers in the field rarely tasted it at all. Yet here, in America, bacon was so plentiful the farmer served it to prisoners without a second thought. When the plate reached Otto, he stared at it. Crisp edges, golden fat. The smell of smoke and salt. He lifted a piece to his mouth. The first bite filled him with heat and memory and grief so raw it felt like a wound reopening. He stood, hands shaking violently, not from hunger, from the force of everything breaking inside him. "I cannot," he whispered. "It is too much." The farmer, not understanding, rose from his chair. "Something wrong, son?" Otto tried to speak, but his voice broke. "Why are you doing this?" he finally managed. "Why give us this food? We came here as your enemies." The farmer looked at him for a long moment. Then he sighed and sat down again. "My boy is fighting in Europe," he said quietly. "Maybe he's fighting men like you. Maybe he's already come across someone hungry, someone scared, someone's son." He folded his hands. "If someone out there is kind to him, I aim to be kind to you." Otto couldn't breathe. His vision blurred again. He felt himself sinking. Not from weakness, but from the collapse of something far deeper, the belief that strength required cruelty, that nations proved themselves through domination, that enemies were less than human. Here, in the warm dusk of a Kansas farm, an American farmer had overturned everything he thought he knew. Otto sat down heavily, staring at the grass. When he finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. "We were told Americans were monsters." The farmer shook his head slowly. "Monsters don't feed their prisoners better than their own folks." And just like that, the truth crystallized. America wasn't showing mercy because it was desperate. It was showing mercy because it was powerful. Too powerful to fear kindness. Industrial might had made cruelty unnecessary. Abundance had made generosity effortless. Faith and small-town decency had made compassion instinctive. The United States produced 96,000 planes a year, 8 million tons of Liberty ships, half the world's meat. A nation so vast and strong that even its tenderness could crush the beliefs of those who had been taught to hate it. Otto bowed his head, bacon still trembling in his hand. For the first time since the war began, he had no explanation, no ideology, no defense. Only one question remained. Why would an enemy be kinder than our own officers? No one answered. In the silence, Otto began to cry, openly, without shame, without restraint, and the others followed one by one, until the Kansas dusk was filled with the quiet, aching sound of men who no longer knew how to carry the weight of kindness. As summer deepened, Kansas settled into the steady rhythm of wartime America. A nation stretched across oceans yet anchored by millions of ordinary families determined to carry the burden of a global conflict with dignity. For the German prisoners, each passing week revealed more of a country they scarcely believed could exist. And for Otto Weber, Every new experience felt like stepping deeper into a world that contradicted everything he had been raised to expect. By August 1944, the United States had mobilized the greatest wartime effort in human history. Men shipped off to Europe and the Pacific. Women filled factories, building planes, tanks, and engines at a rate so staggering that even the German High Command whispered about it in dread. Children collected scrap metal. Churches prayed for sons overseas. The entire nation, from New York tenements to Kansas farms, moved with a sense of unity that felt almost impossible to describe. And yet, amid the fear and sacrifice, America never abandoned its belief that decency was part of its strength. On the Kansas farm, Otto saw that belief made real every day. One afternoon after chores, the farmer's son, home on leave before returning to his training unit, brought out a baseball glove and a worn leather ball. He tossed it into the air, caught it lazily, then glanced over at the prisoners resting in the shade. "You boys ever play?" he asked in friendly curiosity. The Germans exchanged puzzled glances. Baseball was as foreign to them as the vast Kansas sky. But the young Americans smiled and began demonstrating. No judgment, no condescension, just a simple desire to share something familiar. Franz volunteered first. His first attempts were clumsy. The glove swallowed his hand, and he flinched at the speed of the throws. But soon he was laughing, an unguarded laugh none of the men had heard since before the war. Others joined in, forming makeshift teams in the dirt clearing beside the barn. Even the guards, off duty and leaning on the fence, shouted advice or jokes. By the end of the afternoon, Otto realized something astonishing. They were no longer prisoners and guards. They were just men, young, exhausted, homesick, trying to forget the war for a few hours. The Kansas wind carried the sound of their laughter across the fields. A week later, a sudden storm swept over the plains. Thunder cracked like artillery. Rain lashed the earth with brutal force. The farmhouse shook, and the barn groaned under the pressure of the wind. When morning came, the destruction was clear. A section of the cattle pens had collapsed, and several animals were trapped in the mud. Without waiting for permission, the German prisoners ran toward the wreckage. Otto waded through knee-deep muck, pushing against the broken fencing to free a terrified steer. Franz and Dieter hauled ropes. The farmer joined them, surprised but grateful. Even the guards rolled up their sleeves, shouting instructions over the chaos. For an hour they worked side by side, indistinguishable in the grime and rain. When the final animal was freed, everyone stood catching their breath, soaked and muddy, looking at one another with a shared sense of accomplishment. The farmer clapped Otto's back. "Good work, son. Couldn't have saved him without you boys." It was a simple sentence. But for Otto, who had never been praised by his German officers except as a political expectation, the farmer's sincere gratitude felt like an entirely new experience. That evening, after the animals had settled and the storm passed, the prisoners returned to camp. As night fell, a guard named Corporal Matthews, a quiet, soft-spoken man from Oklahoma, sat outside the barracks humming "Silent Night." Otto heard the melody through the open window and felt his chest tighten with memory. He stepped outside, another prisoner joined, then another. By the third verse, the Germans began to hum along in uncertain voices. The hymn, Stille Nacht, had been born in their homeland more than a century earlier. Now it drifted through an American POW camp in the middle of Kansas, blending two worlds that the war had torn apart. By the fourth verse, the guard's voice faltered, overcome by emotion. He wiped his eyes, embarrassed, but Otto understood. My mother used to sing it," the corporal whispered, almost to himself. "Every Christmas?" Otto swallowed. "Mine too," he replied, and for a moment, just a small, fragile moment, the war felt distant, like a nightmare slowly fading with dawn. In late August, the farmer invited the prisoners to share a Sunday meal on the porch. He explained it to the guards beforehand. The camp commander approved it reluctantly, but with a nod of respect. "If that man is willing to trust them at his table," the commander said, "that says something about the character of this community." The table overflowed with food: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, fresh rolls, a salad tossed with garden vegetables, and peach cobbler still warm from the oven. The prisoners hesitated at first, unsure if they were truly welcome, but the farmer's wife waved them forward with gentle insistence. "Sit," she said. "A Sunday table shouldn't have empty seats." The Germans bowed their heads as the farmer said grace. He prayed for his son overseas, for the end of the war, for the safety of all families on every side. Then he added a final line that made Otto look up sharply. "And Lord, bless the hands that help us here. They work hard, and they are far from home." No German officer had ever spoken of them that way. No enemy had ever included them in a prayer. As they ate, the conversation flowed. The farmer asked Otto about Hamburg. The farmer's wife asked whether he liked the cobbler. The farmer's daughter shyly asked Franz whether the stars looked the same in Germany. The men answered quietly, but with growing confidence. They were no longer surprised by kindness, only overwhelmed by its persistence. In those weeks, Otto came to understand something profound about America. It wasn't just the abundance of food or the scale of industry, though both were impossible to ignore. The United States produced 96,000 aircraft a year and built Liberty ships faster than any enemy could destroy them. It harvested enough grain to feed half the world. It had energy, confidence, and a belief in progress that felt unshakable. But the deeper strength, the one that left the greatest mark, lay in the people. The greatest generation had grown up in the Great Depression, forged by hardship yet shaped by a moral code that valued fairness, community, and humility. The war had taken their sons, their brothers, their husbands, yet it had not taken their humanity. A family who had lost a boy at Normandy still fed German prisoners without bitterness. A cowboy whose cousin was killed in Italy still taught Otto how to sit a horse. A guard whose brother was fighting in the Pacific still sang a Christmas hymn with the enemy. This was the America that astonished Otto most. A nation that did not let hatred dictate its behavior. There was a sense, whispered at the church gatherings and written in local newspapers, that America had a responsibility not only to win the war, but to win it right. To fight fiercely, yet treat prisoners honorably. To defend freedom, yet show mercy. To be strong, yet remain kind. Otto sensed that the people here believed in something larger than themselves, a shared identity, a vision of what their country should be, and in that unity he saw a strength more formidable than any weapon. At night, lying on his bunk, Otto sometimes wondered whether America would always be like this. He heard guards talk about rationing, about political debates in Washington, about tensions in cities far away. He sensed that not everything in the country was perfect, but the America he saw with his own eyes, the America of farms and small towns, of Sunday dinners and shared hymns, felt like a place built on bedrock values, a place where kindness wasn't strategy, it was character. And he couldn't help but think, there was a time America built faster than enemies could destroy, a time when the country stood together, not apart, a time when kindness was not political. It was simply American. Whether that time would last, he didn't know. But he knew this. In 1944, on a Kansas farm, the enemy had shown him a version of America that the world would remember long after the war ended. And it was beautiful. By early September, something had begun to shift inside Otto Weber. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, like a river carving its way through stone. The shock of kindness, the steady drumbeat of decency, the small moments of shared humanity, each one chipped away at the world he had carried with him from Germany. A world built on suspicion, obedience, and fear. He did not notice the exact moment he crossed the invisible threshold. But one morning, he woke and realized he no longer looked over his shoulder expecting betrayal. The guards were still guards. The fences were still fences. But the threat behind them had dissolved. For the first time, Otto felt something he had not felt in years. Safety. The awakening came into clearer focus the day mail arrived from Europe. A Red Cross officer carried the sack into camp, handing bundles of letters to the German interpreter. The prisoners quieted. Some stepped forward eagerly. Others hung back, afraid of what news might come from a homeland battered by fire and ruin. Otto received a single envelope, thin, worn, edges yellowed by travel across oceans. The handwriting was his mother's. He tore it open. The letter trembled in his hands. "Food is scarce," she wrote. "Bread lines are long. We boil potatoes until the water turns gray. Our street was bombed again. Your sister works in a factory 12 hours a day. We have not tasted meat since Easter." Otto stopped reading. His vision blurred. He thought of the Kansas farm, the beef stew, the glasses of milk, the apples. He thought of the farmer's wife placing peach cobbler in front of him without hesitation. Shame and gratitude collided inside him, twisting into something he had no name for. He took a breath and continued reading. "Your capture. It frightens me. We were told Americans treat prisoners like slaves, but I pray those stories are lies. Are you alive, my son? Are you cold? Are you hungry?" Otto folded the letter slowly, hands shaking. The lies he'd been told, lies he had repeated, believed, lived by, now felt like chains crumbling one link at a time. That evening he borrowed a pencil and a sheet of paper from the camp office. He sat at a wooden table beneath a single bulb, the Kansas night humming with crickets, and began writing the most painful truth he had ever admitted. "Mother, I am alive. I am fed. I am safe. You must know the truth. The enemy trusts us more than our own officers ever did." He paused, swallowing hard. "America treats us not as animals, but as men. I did not believe such a country existed." He signed his name and sealed the envelope. For the first time, he felt the burden in his chest begin to lift. A few days later, while helping the farmer mend a fence damaged by cattle, Otto found himself working beside Corporal Matthews, the same guard who had hummed "Silent Night" during the storm. They dug post holes, tamped down soil, stretched wire across the pasture in the warm afternoon sun. After an hour of quiet work, Matthews spoke without looking up. "You boys work hard," he said. "Can't say we expected that." Otto nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Because we are prisoners." "Maybe," Matthews said, "but plenty of prisoners in history refuse to lift a finger." He glanced at Otto. "Y'all don't act like men who hate us." The words hung in the air. Otto felt the truth inside them. "We were taught to," Otto said finally. "Taught that Americans are shallow, decadent, cruel." Matthews snorted. "We heard the same about you Germans." He jabbed the shovel into the dirt. "But looks like most folks are just folks." Otto swallowed. "You defeated us by kindness," he said quietly. The guard paused, leaning on the shovel. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Matthews nodded once. "Kindness ain't weakness, son," he said. "It's what strong men can afford." Otto felt the words settle deep inside him, like a seed falling into fertile soil. As September faded into October, the camp commander began offering voluntary English classes. Otto signed up without hesitation. He sat on a wooden bench beside other POWs in a converted recreation hall, while an elderly Kansas schoolteacher, Mrs. Hartley, taught them grammar, vocabulary, and American idioms. She brought them dictionaries, notebooks, even small wrapped candy she bought with her own ration stamps. One evening, after class ended, she told them something Otto never forgot. "History won't remember every battle," she said softly, "but it will remember how we treated one another." The room went silent. "This war will end," she continued, "and you will go home. What you carry with you, how you speak of this country, will shape more than you realize." Otto understood, perhaps for the first time, that American kindness had purpose, not manipulation, not strategy in the cruel sense, but a larger vision. Win the peace, not just the war. America wasn't trying to break their bodies. It was trying to reshape their understanding of what strength could be. The next turning point came during harvest season. The farmer invited the prisoners to join his family and neighbors in a community dinner celebrating the end of the wheat harvest. Tables were set up under lanterns. Children ran between benches. Church elders offered prayers. Women brought casseroles, pies, and baskets of rolls still steaming from the oven. The POWs stood awkwardly at first, unsure if they belonged, but the farmer waved them in. "Grab a plate," he said. "Ain't nobody eating alone tonight." An elderly man with a cane approached Otto as he filled his plate. His eyes were kind but tired, eyes that had seen the Great Depression up close and sent a son to France in this war. "You're far from home, boy," the man said. His voice cracked slightly. "Eat with us." Otto lowered his plate. "Why?" he asked. "Your country is at war with mine." The old man nodded. "My son is over there, same as your brother's." He paused. "If he were captured, I'd pray someone treated him like a human being." Otto's throat tightened. He bowed his head in respect. That night, as lanterns flickered and laughter echoed across the fields, Otto realized something profound. America didn't see kindness as a risk. It saw cruelty as a threat to its own identity. By November, Otto's transformation was complete enough that even the guards noticed. He walked with more ease. He spoke more English. He laughed during baseball games. He knelt to pet the farm dogs without flinching. One morning, while stacking hay bales in the barn, the farmer motioned him over. "You remind me of my nephew," the farmer said. "Hard-working, quiet, always thinking." He paused, then added, "You're going to do fine when you get home." Otto stared at him. "Home," he repeated, the word suddenly feeling unfamiliar. "What will be left?" The farmer looked out across the field, the wind rippling through wheat. "Whatever's left," he said, "you boys will help rebuild it." Then he placed a hand on Otto's shoulder. "And don't forget what you learned here." Otto felt a weight inside him shift, turning fear into resolve, bitterness into understanding, strength without cruelty, power without arrogance, victory without dehumanization. This was the America he now saw through clear eyes. As winter approached, Otto wrote another letter home. This one came easier. "Mother, if I return, I will bring back more than my uniform. I will bring back what I learned here. America is strong because it is kind. It wins not only battles but hearts. They do not fear mercy. They embrace it. I want you to know this. I want everyone to know this." He paused before adding one last line. "You must believe me. America did not defeat us with weapons. America defeated us with compassion." He signed it and sealed it, knowing this truth would follow him long after he left Kansas. For Otto Weber, the war had shattered one world. But in an American farm town, kindness had built him a new one. December arrived with a thin crust of frost on the Kansas fields and a quietness that felt different from the months before. It wasn't the stillness of fear or uncertainty. It was the hush that comes before goodbye, the kind that settles into the bones long before the first steps are taken. For Otto Weber, the final morning on the farm felt unreal. The sky was pale pink, the wheat stubble glittered with frozen dew, and the farmhouse porch light glowed softly in the early dawn. The truck that would take them to the rail depot waited near the barn, its engine idling, white steam curling into the cold air. The farmer stood by the tailgate, hands in his pockets, staring at the ground as if searching for the right words in the dirt. His wife held a small basket covered with a cloth. Their daughter stood behind them, clutching her coat tightly. Otto approached slowly. He didn't know how to say goodbye to people who had dismantled his hatred not through argument, but through pie, patience, and simple humanity. The farmer cleared his throat. "Well," he began, voice rougher than usual, "reckon this is it, son." Son. That word again. It hit Otto harder than any farewell ever had. He held out his hand. The farmer grasped it firmly, then pulled him unexpectedly into a brief, tight embrace. Otto felt the man's shoulders shake once before he let go. "You boys worked hard," the farmer said. "Real hard. I won't forget that." The farmer's wife stepped forward, lifting the cloth from her basket. Inside were biscuits, wrapped carefully in wax paper, and a jar of apple butter. "For the journey," she said softly. "Trains get cold." Otto blinked rapidly, fighting the burn in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." When he turned away, the farmer's daughter took a small step toward him. She was barely 12. She offered him a folded piece of paper. "I drew this," she said shyly. Otto unfolded it. A pencil sketch of the farm, the barn, the oak tree, the fields behind it, and near the fence line, tiny figures of men and horses. She had drawn the prisoners working alongside her father. "It's beautiful," Otto said, his voice breaking. The girl looked up at him with wide, earnest eyes. "Will you ever come back?" Otto swallowed. "In my memories," he said softly. "Always." The truck rumbled down the dirt road, leaving the farm behind in a cloud of dust. The prisoners rode in silence, each gripping their small bundles, each lost in private grief. As they passed the last bend, Otto twisted around to look one final time. The farmer stood by the mailbox waving slowly, his hat pressed over his chest. The wind pushed against his coat, and for a moment he looked like a figure carved out of the land itself, solid, rooted, timeless. Otto raised his hand in return. The truck turned. The farm disappeared. At the rail depot, the POWs were transferred to a guarded platform. Some townspeople had gathered, not in anger, but out of a solemn curiosity. Among them were small children, waving awkwardly. One little boy held out a candy bar, pressing it into Franz's hand as the line passed. Franz nearly broke down right there. A cowboy Otto recognized from the ranch work arrived on horseback, trotting to the edge of the platform. He swung off, walked straight to Otto, and extended a gloved hand. "Take care of yourself," he said simply. Otto shook his hand. "I will remember everything you taught me." The cowboy tipped his hat. "Good." Then he added quietly, "Maybe remembering's what matters." The train carried them north to the port where a Liberty ship waited to take hundreds of prisoners back across the Atlantic. When Otto climbed the gangway onto the deck, the cold ocean wind hit him like a wall. He walked to the railing, gripping the metal as the coastline stretched out in a long, fading line of brown and green. Kansas wasn't visible, but in his mind he saw it. The farm, the barn, the oak tree, the Sunday table, the baseball games, the shared hymns. Behind him, Dieter approached carrying a small scrap of paper. He held it out. "I want you to hear this." It was a line from Dieter's journal. In careful handwriting, it read, "I came as a prisoner. I leave as a witness." Otto exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said, "that is true." They both turned back to the shrinking shore. When the ship finally pulled away, leaving America receding behind a curtain of mist, Otto felt something inside him settle with a clarity almost painful. He wasn't returning as the man who had arrived. The hatred had dissolved. The fear had thinned. The ideology had shattered. In its place was something simpler, sturdier, built not from slogans or commands, but from the actions of ordinary Americans who never asked anything in return. He imagined his future, a ruined Germany, but also a rebuilding one, a generation searching for direction, a need for teachers, leaders, healers. He imagined telling his mother about the farm, telling children one day about America's fields, telling students about a strength that didn't require cruelty. He imagined becoming part of a generation that would reshape Germany, not through force, but through understanding. And he knew this: America hadn't just beaten Germany's armies, it had defeated the worst parts of their hearts, not with bombs, not with propaganda, but with compassion so unwavering it became irresistible. A victory no nation had ever achieved so completely. Years later, Otto would tell the story to his own children, sitting at a kitchen table in a rebuilt Hamburg. He would describe the Kansas wheat fields, the American farmer, the pie, the coat, the laughter during baseball, the warmth of a shower, the strength of ordinary people who didn't confuse power with cruelty. And his children would grow up admiring a country they had never seen, one their father described with quiet awe. Many letters would cross the Atlantic in those decades, some from Otto, some from other former POWs, some from their children and grandchildren, all carrying the same message: "Thank you, America." As the Liberty ship sailed east, Otto pressed his hand against the cold railing and whispered his final words to the land fading behind him. "I came as a prisoner. I leave as a witness." And for the rest of his life, he carried Kansas with him. Not a place of captivity, but a place of awakening. A reminder of what a nation could be at its best. A reminder of a time when America was strong enough to be kind, and kind enough to change the world.